You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. More than 34,000 people are homeless across the Bay Area, and more than 800,000 live in poverty. And that poverty is most acute among people of color. How did it come to this?
A white worker would come in, my grandfather would train them, and then within, a week or two, that person would suddenly get a promotion above my grandfather. The union was complicit in sort of this marginalization of African Americans.
There's a story that the government went after my great-grandfather and shut down all 17 of his businesses, or made it difficult for him to operate his businesses because he was just too high profile.
I'm Sylvie Sturm, and this is Civic. Growing up in Canada as a hippie kid in the 1970s, I had this romantic notion of San Francisco as a city full of free-spirited, creative people who wanted to make the world a kinder, gentler place. I know the flower power era is long gone, but still, when I moved to the Bay Area 7 years ago, I was in for a shock.
The growing gap between rich and poor Americans is one of the biggest challenges facing the country.
Every week, about 200 people line up in cars on Remillard Court in San Jose to get free food.
More Bay Area families are going hungry and seeking food assistance.
My first experience witnessing astounding wealth inequality was when I was a teenager traveling through Central America. Looking out the window of a chicken bus bumping along dusty roads, I saw miles and miles of tin shacks barely protecting families from the elements next to mansions protected by barbed wire fences. It made me deeply uneasy, and not just because it seemed so unfair. I sensed a dark foreboding, an impending breakdown of an entire society. That's the same feeling I get today when I walk through parts of San Francisco. I see people so poor they have to live in tents on sidewalks next to multi-million-dollar condos and $80,000 cars. Even hedge fund magnates like billionaire Ray Dalio's are sounding the alarm. Here he is talking to CNN in December 2020.
If we don't have broad productivity and employment, which comes from education and jobs programs and such, then we're going to have a continuation of the worsening, the greater polarity, and I think that that'll be a problem. So yes, that's something that has to be dealt with. History has taught us these things. I've studied the last 500 years of history in cycles, and these things repeat over and over again. Large wealth gaps with large values gaps at the same time as there's a lot of debt and there's an economic downturn produces conflict and vulnerability, and that will be with us unless the economy is good for most people. Most people could be productive and effective and benefit.
According to Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, the wealth gap is baked into the system. Stiglitz explained during an interview with the French daily paper La Croix.
Why is America the country with the highest level of income inequality among the advanced countries? The inequalities in market incomes are affected by, more broadly, the rules of the game. And those rules of the game have weakened workers' bargaining power, weakened labor unions, strengthened corporate power. We haven't increased the minimum wage in line with inflation. You can work full time and still be in poverty, still need to get food from food banks. So we created a system which is, I would say, unusually cruel.
It's really baffling because the very country itself was founded on principles of equality. The economist Richard Freeman explained in a lecture for the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality.
If you go back in U.S. history, the founding fathers of our country were deeply concerned about inequality. They did not want us to have an aristocracy and a bunch of poor people working in the country. And they believed the right solution was that everybody should have their own plot of land and should therefore be an independent farmer. Tom Jefferson, George Washington, all of them believed that.
But today, 40% of U.S. households are a paycheck away from poverty. That's according to the economic advocacy group Prosperity Now. And the Public Policy Institute of California, it says that income inequality is only expected to grow substantially in the coming years. But even though poverty is so prevalent, the poor and unhoused are still treated with contempt and hostility. I've seen so many videos of San Francisco city workers and police performing so-called sweeps, throwing tents and possessions into dump trucks as their owners look on in complete distress. Like this one, captured last summer by Kelly Cutler from the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness.
I wasn't offered anything because I never got a time to stop from moving my stuff to say, hey, I need a room, I need a shower, I need food.
Right.
I don't know what else to do when 3 days in a row we're told to pack up and move. This is harassment.
Absolutely.
They don't like the homeless. They don't want the homeless here. They want us dead. That's how the mayor feels about us.
Videos and news broadcasts show us how bad things have gotten, but they don't show us how it came to this. So I took a deep dive into the history of policies, power grabs, and cultural norms that contributed to this severe gap in wealth. I started by looking at the last time wealth inequality got this extreme. That was during the so-called Gilded Age of the 19th century. Railroad barons and industrial magnates became unimaginably rich. But under the shiny surface of prosperity lurked poverty, unemployment, and corruption. Then came the Great Depression.
The market broke very sharply, and a lot of people were wiped out with it. It was very painful.
The poverty was really all around us. It was really, really pitiful.
What we see today is eerily comparable. The difference is that during the Great Depression, the poor and unhoused were not criminalized.
So many people are negatively impacted by poverty, by hunger, by homelessness, that the shame of it goes away because it's what everybody faces. So if all of your neighbors are in the same boat as you, then you're not stigmatized as the poor person, the failure.
Diane Fry is a labor studies professor at San Francisco State University. She recently co-edited and contributed to a textbook called Human Rights and Economic Inequalities.
The misery was so far spread during the Depression that it just created an opening to say, oh, well, we need to fix this. People, when they're old, need to have security. There needs to be a minimum wage.
So President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a vow.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Among the New Deal policies was legislation crafted to empower workers.
They passed the National Labor Relations Act in the 1930s, and it wasn't because they so much really cared about justice and social justice. It went to the issue of there's a massive depression and employers aren't putting enough money in workers' pockets to help the economy to recover. And so it was really putting their finger on the scale to allow workers, and even the original bill talks about they want to encourage collective bargaining. And so they create the National Labor Relations Act, the National Labor Relations Board, to enable workers to be able to organize and do collective bargaining.
But those New Deal programs, they did next to nothing to help African Americans out of poverty. Venice Wagner is a journalism professor at San Francisco State University.
New Deal programs were restricted for Blacks. And that was because in order for Roosevelt to get that through Congress, he had to strike a deal with Democrats, Southern Democrats, who wanted to maintain Jim Crow policies or practices. Even Social Security, when it first started, excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers from Social Security benefits. And that didn't change until 1954.
So beyond actually being exclusionary of African Americans, they exclude the industries and the workforce that is primarily African American.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Wagner wrote an article called Living Red, Black Steelworkers and the Wealth Gap. It won the 2018 Best Journal article for the United Association of Labor Education. The article was about the discrimination her grandfather endured while working in a Chicago steel mill in 1942.
A white worker, usually an immigrant worker, would come in. My grandfather would train them, and then within, a week or two, that person would suddenly get a promotion above my grandfather. This happened to him over and over again. And the other thing that was happening in this steel mill is that jobs were sequenced. If you can imagine that it takes various steps, some steps end up being broken down into a certain sequence of steps. Union rules where you could not be promoted from one sequence to the other. You could only be promoted within a sequence. And so that meant if Black workers were caught in the dirtiest sequences, then pretty much their jobs would remain primarily as unskilled labor jobs, which meant they got lower wages, right? And this was all sort of dictated and agreed upon by the union. So the union was complicit in sort of this marginalization of African Americans.
Many Asian American families in the Bay Area were also stripped of generational wealth. Among them is Derek Sue. Sue's great-grandfather, Lu Hing, immigrated to the U.S. in 1871.
My great-grandfather, he came here, he was really young. He originally came here, he was about 11 when he first arrived. His older brother went back to China, but unfortunately was killed in a fire on board the ship. And so he was literally left here in America by himself, not speaking any English and having to face a lot of racism of the time.
Despite these enormous challenges, Lu Hing became one of the wealthiest Chinese immigrants in the country. He was a founding father of Chinatown in San Francisco and in Oakland. He was the first president of the Bank of Canton, and he built 2 hotels, among many other businesses. But he was best known as a giant in the canning industry. It all began when he pioneered a form of soldering that's still used in canning today. By 1914, his company, Pacific Coast Canning, was the largest employer in Oakland, with more than 1,000 employees during the height of the canning season. Then he went global. During World War I, the company began supplying canned goods to the starving civilian population of German-occupied Belgium. The historical impact that Lu Hing's tins had on Europe and the U.S. is immeasurable.
At the time, early 1900s, we were just coming out of the Wild West scene, and so Wild Bill Cody was one of the big attractions. Well, it was a figurine similar to the Wild Bill Cody on the label. And so it introduced cowboys and Indians to the rest of the world. And that's what opened up the eyes of the world. That, wow, there's great food here coming from Oakland, California. We need to go there. And so that opened the doors to a lot of our immigrants from Portugal, from Spain, from Ireland, from Scotland, to come here to America and be sure of a job. It's like, oh, a place like this, they're making such great canned goods, foods. They have to be employing people. And the factory did.
Last March, I met up with Sue in Oakland at a city-sanctioned homeless encampment that he shares with 3 other people. He's been there since 2012. He stood in the open doorway of an enclosed living space. It was surrounded by a massive silver tarp.
It's a combination of 2 pop-up frames and then some boards coming across the middle to create the doorway. There's windows in there. There's one next to the bed and then one right here by the front door. That is the fire code ingress and egress. It meets those requirements.
Sue gave me a tour of what remained of Lu Hing's legacy in Oakland. We started at the site of Lu Hing's Pacific Coast Canning Company on 12th and Pine. It's now a quiet residential neighborhood. In 2006, the long-abandoned cannery was torn down and replaced with a condo complex. The developers acknowledged the importance of the site by calling it the Pacific Cannery Lofts.
That's the original concrete going into the entrance here. That used to be where everybody had entered the building, the cannery, right here. And so we're still looking at the original concrete steps leading up into the building, plus the pillars on the side.
We entered the wide breezeway of the open-air ground floor. Large decorative pieces made of iron industrial canning machinery were placed along a pathway called the Lu Hing Garden Boardwalk.
That was real interesting to see, is they used actual pieces of iron, measured out iron for counterbalance. So it was real fun to see old stuff, the breaker throws, the pillars, brought back some memories.
How so?
It's been so long since I last seen this place. I used to literally just be across the street at a friend's place. So I spent time down here, and I know the building, but it wasn't the building was open. It was kind of open because nobody was here. It was fenced off, but you could always get through fences and go look at stuff and explore as a kid.
Did you know as a kid that this was your great-grandfather's business?
No, I didn't know. I didn't truly understand back then.
Next, we visited a Mountain View Cemetery mausoleum where Lu Hing and his wife are entombed. This is lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Nice little green oasis in the middle of a building. Oh, wait, I see it. Lu Hing, right?
Yeah, that's it. He is upstairs. That's them. They are upstairs. Okay, we'll go upstairs and go visit. Stairs, and here we go. Yeah, that's his great-grandfather. Yeah, Lu Hing, born 1858, passed away 1934. My great-grandmother, Chin Shi Lu, she was born 1860, passed away 1947.
Lu Hing's descendants were initially unable to provide him with a dignified resting place. It wasn't until the late 1970s that he was exhumed and entombed in a location worthy of his stature.
Where he was situated previously was a horrible location. It was like being in the middle of the woods in a horror movie. I mean, everything's overgrown. The trees are mostly dead weeds, dead shrubs. You see a number marker on the ground, and that's it.
That's because by the time Lu died in 1934, he had been forced to liquidate most of his business holdings, leaving him stripped of the wealth he spent his whole life earning. Sue's cousin, Bruce Kwan Jr., wrote a book about it titled Bitter Roots: 5 Generations of a Chinese Family in America. He talked about it on the East Bay Yesterday podcast.
There's a story that the government went after my great-grandfather and shut down all 17 of his businesses, or made it difficult for him to operate his businesses.
The federal government or the
federal
city?
Government?
Okay, gotcha.
Went after him because he was just too high profile.
Asian businesses all over California were victimized by violent rampages that threatened lives and destroyed property. Among them was Lu Hing's cannery in Antioch. Last year, local news outlets examined the violent past when Antioch leaders apologized for the city's disgraceful history. KPIX News detailed some of the atrocities.
In 1876, an angry white mob forced all the Chinese to leave, and when some tried to return, they burned Chinatown to the ground. Today, on that very spot, the mayor committed to redesignating the area as the Chinatown Historic District, with historical markers, public art, and a permanent exhibit at the Antioch Museum. And perhaps the most important thing of all, an official apology from the city.
Sue firmly believes that had it not been for the racist policies and actions against his family, their legacy would look much different today.
We were the third largest on the entire West Coast. So we were competing against like the Del Montes, which still exist today. So we would still be a rival if it weren't for the racist laws that took our business away. I feel that we would have been equal to some of the largest food manufacturing families, but because of the way things worked out, a lot of our family was devastated by this.
There's this widespread belief in America that people who live on the street are there because they're too lazy to get a job, or they're addicted to drugs, or they're crazy and won't take their meds. But in reality, lots of people end up on the street because their meager income didn't cover the rent, or they lost a job that barely kept them afloat. And trying to survive while unhoused makes it nearly impossible to work.
For the unhoused, getting a job is really difficult. Number one, you don't have an address. And that's something that they see right away. Why don't you have an address on this application or in the application? Well, I'm homeless. I can tell you 10 out of 10 times you will be disqualified just for that fact. Number two, trying to keep that job. If you were able to land that job, now you have to keep a level of hygiene and cleanliness so that you can stay on that job. And living homeless, it's extremely difficult. At one point, a driver, he was a full-time driver for a major delivery service. And he couldn't afford an apartment. And every evening, he put on his uniform and go to work. Come home just about the crack of dawn, sleep all day. And then he has to get ready to go to work that evening, but then he still got the dirt and everything from the previous night on him, so he needed to clean up. That's where it's extremely difficult without a shower available at most any time or reasonable hours. It's impossible for people to hold a job for any kind of length of time because they can't stay clean. And not only clean, but also your laundry. So your clothes have to look clean, you have to smell clean. Then there's personal hygiene, haircuts, facial hair, things like that. That's very difficult for homeless because a lot of them don't have access to those hygiene supplies. And some of those hygiene supplies that do come aren't the right ones. There's a lot of issues with getting a job and then maintaining that job. And then transportation to and from is a huge issue, especially if you have to pay for it. If you have to pay for transportation, you have to plan out, and that becomes part of your loss and cost of doing business.
During the Great Depression of the 1930s, President Roosevelt's New Deal also introduced policies to help millions of World War II veterans secure housing. But once again, those policies didn't extend to the non-white population.
If a white person dared rent to a Black person, people would be so upset, they would literally throw firebombs into the home to scare them. They would write threatening notes saying, you better get out of here or we're going to, kill you.
We'll get to that in part 2 of this series. We'll also talk about the backlash against policies that empowered unions and workers, and what happened when the elite class decided to take the power back.
It allowed employers to begin to campaign against union election efforts. And so we see the whole rise of union busting law firms and kind of the social science, social psychology of union busting.
That's coming up soon. I'm Sylvie Sturm. You've been listening to Civic. Civic is produced by KSFP LP, a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Our team includes producer Leanna Wilcox and contributor Mel Baker, who's also program director for KSFP. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Thanks for listening.